Well, thank you for joining me, Andy.
No worries.
We are doing a collection of views from AMPs, as we talked about. So I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions, and let's see where we end up.
Yeah,
So,
sounds good.
so many, many moons ago, when we first met, I remember you saying to me, "I want to be an AMP. That's where I want to be."
Yeah,
So my first question is, why did you?
I think it was a number of things that had happened, and so I started working in social work by chance. Really, it was I fell into it. I was actually originally wanted to be a probation officer, but that door closed when I graduated from my degree. Um, and then I was looking at what else can I do that's similar, and I ended up working as a healthcare assistant in a hospital, just trying to earn some money while I made that decision. But then a role for social work assistant came up, and that's how I ended up in mental health. And working in that role made me change my view from wanting to work in probation to wanting to work in more mental health and social work. And the two roles, probation and social work, are obviously closely linked. Um,
Indeed.
so it kind of changed my view as to what I wanted to do. And whilst I was in that social work assistant role, there were a number of things that kept happening on wards, and you're exposed to a lot of things around the mental health generally, Mental Health Act legislation, because the social work team in the hospital were dealing a lot with those legislative, can't say the word, legislative law,
Legislative? No, I can't know either.
the law
Yeah.
of mental health. And there was a couple of dilemmas that happened, and then an amp came onto the ward, and when there was a lot of people around us making lots of noise and uncertainty and not knowing what to do, when the amp came in as a fresh face, and to me at that time, and I was quite fresh in the world, they seemed to be the one that everyone just listened to, and they had the expertise, the knowledge, and just knew what to do and knew how to handle the situation. And it's something that when I was doing my training, and AMP said to me that one of the biggest parts of the role is managing everyone else's anxieties. And when I think back to when I first came into contact with an AMP, that's exactly what happened. And I remember at that point thinking, that's what I want to do. I want to be that person who can just handle that kind of situation. I was already at a point where I was feeling this is where I want to be, and if this is where I want to be, that's the role I want, because that's the person who can come in and people just know this things are under control now. I
Yeah.
wish that's always the way, but obviously that's how the impression I was left with, as a you know young, fresh faced pre-social worker position, that this is what the AMP role meant to me at that point. And so I just aspired to be an AMP ever since.
So it's a sense of being listened to, credibility,
Yeah,
organising,
yeah, yeah,
being able to make a difference, I guess.
yeah, exactly that. Because for that, the person who was being assessed, because the people around them didn't know what to do, that person was left in limbo. Do they need to be in hospital? Do they not? Do they need to be under this legal
Mm,
framework? Do we not? What's the person's rights? How are we going to manage? The staff around are thinking this is chaos. What can we do? And what do we need to have to make happen? The person themselves is left in limbo because they're not having the
yeah.
right treatment. They don't have any rights in that sort of limbo land.
Mm,
There's no safeguards for that person, and the AMP was able to make sure that the right legal framework is in place, make the person heard and understood, so speak to them and get their views across, but then make sure that when the legal framework's in place, explains to them what their rights are so they understood them.
yeah.
But then, so it made a real difference to that person, even if it wasn't the outcome that person wanted, because they ended up detained under the Mental Health Act. That's not what they wanted. But at least it gave them some answers, and it gave them a framework, and it gave them some guidance, and here's your rights, and we can get an advocate. Um, the staff around them felt more reassured, because they then had some certainty themselves and their anxieties were managed.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
So, so for you, it was more about empowerment than power.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I mean, there's the saying I keep hearing all the time lately is that amps have all of the responsibility but none of the power, but
Yeah.
they do have the empowerment.
Yeah. Yeah. Almost like the calm in the middle of the storm, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So now you've gone off and done the training and you've got your amp spares.
Mm.
Let's start with the training first. Was it what you thought it would be?
Um, yes and no. I mean, I didn't quite know what to expect, so it was the one I did was split with part a couple of days a week at university and taught sessions, and then the rest of the week was spent on placement.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it was a mix, and that lasted a few months. And I suppose that's roughly what I was anticipating. So yeah, I guess in a nutshell, yes, that is what I was roughly expecting. Um, Although I did find the placement side of it far more helpful and informative than the taught classroom part. That's me. That's just probably just my preferred learning method doing,
Yeah.
rather than sitting there listening. But other people may find it more helpful to listen. And I have to put that in the context of, for me, I'd spent 10 years working in and around the Mental Health Act. So
Mm.
a lot of the stuff that was being taught in classroom, I'd worked with over those 10 years and became more familiar with. So for others who perhaps hadn't had that experience, they may have found that the classroom side more useful than
Yeah.
perhaps I did, because some of the stuff I was familiar with. Where what I wasn't as familiar with was, okay, now as an amp, how do I put that into practice? Um,
Yeah.
so that was the bit that I found far more valuable.
Yeah. So it was a placement where you could actually apply that learning.
Yes,
That,
yeah,
that yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Do you think it changed your thinking?
Yes, it did. I think my assessment skills are probably sharper. My critical thinking is sharper. But I'd like to think that, having not just been through the training, but making sure I was as exposed to the AMP world as much as possible. So from the moment I knew I was going to be on my training, I had to wait. So it was agreed that I could go on to it, and there was a full year before I could actually start the training itself.
Mm.
Um, but I was allowed to start shadowing the AMP team from that start of that point when it was agreed. So I had
Hmm.
a year which I was allowed to go in. Um, I was given the opportunity to go twice a month to be around the AMP team before my training started, and again that was quite valuable. So that
Mm.
whole period of um, just exposing myself within the AMP world, that I think made the difference. So I feel like my assessment skills are better, my decision making skills are better, knowing how to handle those situations, just being around the AMP team, listening to the questions that they're asking, things that I perhaps wouldn't have thought to ask before,
Hmm.
seeing how they're making the decisions and how they're coming up with a rationale, how they're the judgments they're making. Um, all those kind of things, just being around it in the same way when you do your social work training, you're learning when you're on placement by being exposed to those, that world and seeing how it's done in
Yeah.
practice. It's the same way with AMP, but for how I look at it, AMP is a that higher level of qualification, of understanding, of expertise within the law. So seeing that put into practice
Mm.
was the bit that I think was helpful. And I think it certainly helped me with my own skills.
Yeah. Yeah. And would you say confidence too?
Yeah,
You said
definitely.
you said at the beginning that that credibility that amp brought in the
Mm.
ward when you were watching. Do you feel you've achieved that by this by,
Yeah,
by going through this?
yeah, definitely. So I think you still have an element of imposter syndrome, and there was when I was on AMP shift a couple of weeks ago, there was an element of that then, but more generally speaking, I definitely feel a lot more confident in managing situations. So my day job, I work in police custody, and um, the role I now have as an AMP, I work for an NHS trust within a criminal justice setting, and I sit within an AMP team. So I'm bridging lots of gaps. So when often people come into contact with the criminal justice system, sometimes it's not that they're a bad person, they're in a crisis situation, and sometimes it's about mental health. And rightly or wrongly, people end up in police custody because of mental health crises. And I've found that I feel a lot more confident in how to manage those situations, know what the options are available, how to ask, what questions to ask, how to navigate around admission, and looking at, is this the right time to request a mental health act assessment? If I had my AMP hat on, what other questions would I be asking? What do I need to communicate to custody sergeants? All those kind of things can come into it. And only the other day we had a lady where all the police staff were jumping up and down saying we need to put this person under 136 as though this is something we need to do. But actually, when I spoke with her, we didn't need to do that. So knowing the right questions to ask, knowing the frameworks, knowing what your options are, allowed me to make sure that actually the most appropriate outcome for this person was achieved. And it happened to be her going to hospital informally under MCA doles. And that was, for her, that was the most appropriate thing. But not only that, on another plus side, had the police done, use 136, that would have taken up the place of safety. That is a scarce resource. And the following day, it was desperately needed because they were trying to execute a warrant for somebody who was at a significant level of risk. And we wouldn't have been able to use that, the place of safety for that warrant. So that would have pushed that back, leaving the other person at a greater risk. So it's that knock-on effect that if the police had just done, then it wouldn't have been right for that person, but it had that knock-on effect for other resources and the other person who's out in the community at the moment.
So the literacy that it's given you means that you've got choices that you can then support people with. We're back to empowerment again, aren't we?
Yeah.
The last question I've got for you then. So what would you say to all those wannabe amps out there that are watching this now and thinking about going on the training? What would be your top tips or your advice to them?
Do it if you're that way inclined. If you're people have their different reasons for wanting to do it. For me, it was that, what I was saying earlier, it was seeing the role in practice, seeing the difference it had for different people, professionals and service users. But I'm also a bit of a law nerd, so for me it was a natural progression. I wanted to learn and absorb all of that. So if you're that way inclined, and it's absolutely the perfect role, but make sure that you're using the opportunities that are available to you. If you've got opportunities from to shadow, make sure you go and shadow. When you're on placement, use the placement. A lot of people on our course, you would hear them say, well, I've got my 3 cases now for their portfolio, and almost rest on their laurels a bit. That I would absolutely say, do not do that. You've got your 3 cases, great, that's brilliant, but keep going back, when you've got the opportunity to lead on the assessment, lead on an assessment as many times as you can, because it's protected, and you've got the support of an AMP sitting over your shoulder who can intervene if needs be, and step in, so it's safe practice. But take those opportunities as much as possible. If you're thinking about doing it, at the very least, if you're thinking about it and you're not sure whether you want to do it or not, go and observe an AMP team. Do a couple of shifts if you can, and then see if this is right for me or not. If it's right for you, absolutely go for it, and then just keep getting that in practice experience.
Learning by doing.
Exactly, it's the best way. I know different AMP teams are structured differently. I'm fortunate in my area, we have a dedicated AMP team, so you're there absorbed within like an AMP hub. And I know not everywhere operates like that. So if you do have that, absolutely try and get in there and just say, I'd like to become an AMP and I'd like to expose myself to this world a bit more. Can I come and shadow? Hopefully they're able to do that. It's certainly priceless for me.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Andy.
No worries.